Hola muchachos y muchachas. Spud here with another Phoenix Racing memory. And today that memory is about the Busch Series inaugural race at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez in Mexico City. The 2005 Telcel Motorola 200. Once again, I've tried to recreate that race using Nascar Racing 2003. And once again, I'd like to thank Project Wildfire for their 2003 Busch Grand National Series mod. I'll be using the 2005 BGN car set by Team SBR, Mass Graphics, and others. The drivers and liveries are as close to the real field in that race as I can get them. However, the sim has limited me to a 28-car field. With that out of the way, let me direct you to the police lineup in this picture of our car. Starting from right to left, we've got my buddy Chuck Myers, who was our car chief at the time. Next up, Paulie Chidora, our tire specialist. And then Matt Greshel, top-notch mechanic and fabricator. And then there is Miss Judy, a retired Delta airline pilot and one of the first groundbreaking female ones. She handled scoring for us during the race. She is followed by yours truly, and behind me is Joey Serdinsky, one of our suspension guys. All of these folks are now out of racing and have been placed throughout the country by the Witness Protection Program. The car, which was driven by Boris Said, is chassis 060. It was bodied as a Dodge Charger that year. The nose on them Chargers always reminded me of a catfish. Enough of this already, let's get to talking about the race. The racetrack opened in 1959 and is named after the Rodriguez brothers, Pedro and Ricardo. It got its name in 1962 following Ricardo's death during practice for the Mexico Grand Prix. His brother Pedro was fearless behind the wheel. He won the 1967 South African Grand Prix at Kyalami in a Cooper and the 1967 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa in a BRM. He also won the 1968 24 Hours of Le Mans in a Ford GT40, as well as 8 races during 1970-71 in a Porsche 917. Pedro was killed in 1971. Formula One raced there from 1962 through 1970, when safety conditions caused a halt. It returned in 1986 with a new pit complex, the one we saw when we raced there, and continued to race there until 1992 when safety concerns again became an issue. CART raced there in 1980-81 and from 2002 to 2007. We could tell it had been a world-class facility, but it did appear just a bit run down when we went there. These two pictures are from the 2006 race, but they give an indication of the female pulchritude that was typical at the track. In the one picture, from left to right, are Scott Ashley, one of our mechanics, Timmy Hammer, our shop foreman and jackman, and I'm the kid in the candy store on the right. As you can see in the next photo, the two girls threw rocks at Scott and Timmy to drive them off when they tried to get into the picture with a very happy me. I guarantee that all the crews remember that first tech inspection. Behind the garage stalls there was a long straight corridor where we passed through all of NASCAR's inspection stations. That corridor had an upper section that had walkways on either side and afforded those upstairs a great view of the cars going through tech. It also gave us a great view looking up at the girls lining the handrails. It was nothing but Mexican hotties. Most of them were wearing awfully short skirts, and it seems that a lot of them had forgotten to put on panties that morning. All of us were staring up in rapt fascination as we pushed the cars along, and there was a lot of one car banging into the one in front of it. I finally moved around the seat post to push because I was tired of the car behind us running into the back of my legs. The pace lap is just about over, and the cars are finishing coming around the famous Peraltada, which was known as turns 7 and 8 for our race's layout of the track. The virtual starter is about to wave the green flag, and then the mayhem typical to a Busch Series road race will ensue. In the real race, and in what was his Busch Series debut, local favorite Jorge Getters sat on the pole. In our sim race, it's Martin Truex who qualified first. Boris Said, driving the number 1 yellow freight car, qualified 4th for the real race and 5th in the sim. Johnny Sauter, driving the number 28 yellow freight car, qualified 29th out of 43 starters in the real race and 23rd out of 28 in the sim. Some of you may be aware of the fact that Johnny was our driver in the number 1 car in 2005. Well, then what was he doing driving in the 28? Johnny made no bones about the fact that road racing wasn't his specialty. It wasn't a knock on his driving ability. Johnny could get it done in a race car. He just didn't have a whole lot of experience in road racing. In point of fact, I checked his stats on the Racing Reference website, and this was his first ever road race in any of the 3 premier NASCAR series. And he didn't do too poorly at this race, as you shall see. But essentially, we were trying to minimize a hit to the owner's points with a potentially poor finish, as well as maximize our odds of winning by putting a road race specialist behind the wheel. Anyways, we made a deal with J. Robinson Racing and ran the 28 number, but on one of our cars. It worked out well for both our teams. I don't think it takes a whole lot of explaining why we'd choose a guy like Boris to drive the number 1 car for that race. He was an absolute stud on the road courses. I've somehow lost my notes for the first practice of that race, but for happy hour, Boris was 3rd quick and Johnny was 18th on the board. That put young Mr. Sauter ahead of quite a few drivers who were very, very good in a road course car. Just watching the cars get around that track, even though it's a sim, brings back a flood of memories. Vivid memories, even memories of pain. I'm not talking about the emotional kind, the kind usually inflicted upon my tender psyche by my mean and heartless teammates. I'm talking real physical pain. The brakes get awful hot on a road course, and I remember the one car fresh off the track after practice and up on 4 stands. I wasn't wearing my heat sleeves and got a lovely racing stripe on one of my forearms when I accidentally touched it to one of the front rotors. You know that everyone has done it at some point, but that don't do much to ease the pain. Luckily, what with my high threshold for such a thing, I suffered in my usual quiet and manly fashion. You may have noticed that the simulated drivers aren't paying the least bit of attention to that chicane on the front stretch. I'm betting Carl Edwards wished he could have done the same in 2005. He somehow lost it coming off the chicane and destroyed his car when he T-boned the infield wall. It was his first year driving full schedules in both the Cup and Busch Series for Jack Roush, and I remember him saying in an interview during the qualifying broadcast that he was considering spending an extra day or 2 in Mexico because he figured that Jack was none too happy. It seems that Jack had called him right before he crashed and was congratulating him on showing the savvy of a veteran, only for him to then go out and wad up the car. He had an awful fast backup car, though, and finished 3rd in the race. By the way, NASCAR did away with that bus stop for the 2007 race in order to allow for more passing on that long front straight. The logistics for those Mexico City races were a huge endeavor for both NASCAR and the teams. In 2005, Mexico City was the 3rd race of the season. It was sandwiched between the 2nd race out in Fontana and the 4th race in Las Vegas. So that's out to the West Coast, down to Mexico, then back out west. And that is with no time to return to the Charlotte area where most of the teams are located. I got a hold of our truck driver from back then, Mike Williams, and asked him about his memories on how we handled it. Mike has always been known throughout the racing community as Bama, and you ought to be able to figure out why on your own. He's been driving Team Penske's 22 hauler the last few years. He was also my catch can man and a great set of eyes to have over the wall. He had great situational awareness. I'd have my head down, gassing the car, and he could make me aware if some kind of situation arose. Anyway, Bama said that we bought a 48-foot gooseneck and that they met at the UPS facility in Laredo and swapped out. For the trip back to Las Vegas, they met at Texas Motor Speedway and swapped out there. He said they convoyed down to Mexico City in 10 truck groups spaced 15 minutes apart. Now, Nascar did everything they could to keep us all together, and so the rest of us flew from Charlotte down to Mexico City on a couple of chartered planes. We had all had to make sure that our passports were current or had applied for and received them sometime before that race. All the teams stayed either in the Presidente Intercontinental or the Hyatt Regency next door to it. They were two of Mexico City's swankiest hotels, and we were strongly advised not to travel off on our own outside of an approximate 2-block area. We were all transported on chartered buses to and from the track every day. There was no getting rental cars, you rode the buses. It was a pretty convoluted route getting to the track, and even included some narrow one-lane alleys. Those bus drivers had some serious skills. Our team was one of those that stayed in the Presidente Intercontinental. It had over 40 floors. My room was up there in the mid to high 30s, and the view of the city at night was fantastic. I'm a history nut, and I could see Chapultepec Castle not too far away, but I was taking that don't wander off advice to heart, and so being able to just see it had to do. Do you remember that line in the Marine Corps hymn about the halls of Montezuma? They are referring to the Battle of Chapultepec that occurred during the Mexican-American War. Some 40 Marines were a part of the 500-man force that attacked the castle. At that time, Chapultepec was Mexico's West Point, and during the battle, 5 cadets and an instructor ignored their orders to retreat and fought the Americans to the death. They are immortalized in Mexico as Los Niños Heroes. Here's one other historical tidbit for you. The red stripe on the sides of the trousers worn by Marine officers and NCOs is known as the blood stripe, and is there as a reminder of the high losses that the Marines incurred during the storming of the castle. Down in the lobby of our hotel, they had set up several booths where we could convert our US dollars into pesos. Boris had won a race down in Mexico City, I don't remember the series, in the early 1990s, and had never bothered converting his winnings into US dollars. He'd packed those winnings into a suitcase, and when we got to the hotel, he took this huge wad of bills, and I emphasize huge, up to the currency exchange, only to be told that all that Mexican cash he was carrying with both hands was worthless. Evidently, at some point after that race in the early 90s, Mexico had introduced a new currency, and now poor Boris was stuck with what was essentially Mexican monopoly money that was not worth the paper it was printed on. Here's another little logistics tidbit for you. NASCAR informed all the teams that the Mexican powers that be had said that we were not to bring food down with us from the States to the track. What they did was set up a big tent in the infield and feed all the crews breakfast and lunch buffet style. They did their best to provide us with what they figured was food we would be used to, bacon, eggs, hash browns, etc. But truthfully, it tasted like someone had described the taste of American fare to them over the phone. I'm not being critical, they did their best. Unfortunately, a lot of us didn't care for what was on the plate and scraped it into the trash barrels. We were classic ugly Americans abroad on foreign soil. Now let me explain something here. The civilians at the track, that is, both the fans and the folks doing the work there, such as waiting on us, picking up the trash, etc., seem to be a microcosm of Mexico City society. I am talking about the haves and the have-nots. If you were descended from European stock, the world was your oyster and you lived well. On the other hand, if your ancestors were indigenous, that is, if you were dark brown in color, the kind of people that we Americans saw coming across our border to pick our crops, cut our lawns, and whatnot, well, you were just trying to do your best to survive. Remember what I said about many of us scraping our food into the trash? I saw a lot of those people pulling that food out of the trash and eating it. That trip opened my eyes as to why so many did flips and twists to get to America any way that they could. I've never taken for granted being an American citizen since. We are very, very lucky. If you've paid any attention to the sim race running in the background, you've probably realized just how long it takes to complete a lap under yellow at a road course. This is a godsend if your car has taken damage. You've got a lot of time to work on repairs before the field can get back to you and maybe put you a lap down. It looks like this caution period is just about over and the race is about to go back to the green. The two cars we took down to the race were 060 and 061. They were another pair of Billy Hess chassis. I had mentioned in my video on our 2001 win at the Hardee's 250 in Richmond that I had heard people refer to Billy's cars as Hess Mess. That was not meant to be a knock on his quality. It was simply a catchy nickname that caught on because it rhymed. Now I've dug into my files and looked up these two cars' suspension point measurements, and they look to be 3/4 inch drop snouts. Mark Reno, who ran Phoenix Racing and is one of the smartest guys I know, was a bear for light cars. On some of the other teams' road course cars, they ran a pair of bars from the main hoop down to the rear clip in the form of an X in order to help stiffen the rear up. We ran a single diagonal bar from the hoop to the clip. Boris said he could feel the rear clip flexing in the corners, and I know that when we would run a rear spring test on the pull-down with these two cars, you'd hear the rear tin go snap, crackle, boing. The chassis was essentially acting like a fifth spring, and personally I think that's one thing that helped make these cars easier on tires on a long run. I looked up the spindle measurements for these two. They were a 6-degree spindle with roughly a 1/2 inch drop top and a 1 inch drop bottom. When it came to the race setup, we ran a pair of 650-pound springs across the front and 350-pounders across the rear. We raced with an 1.5 inch front bar and a 1/2 inch rear bar. Drop snouts were bad to the bone back in the conventional setup days, but when we went to coil bind and then running around on the stops, where the front end was always slammed down on the ground, that kind of obsoleted the drop snout. I don't know if you noticed the big pileup in the sim race that has brought out another caution, but it has helped our simulated Johnny Sauter move up to 16th place. Johnny caught a similar break in the real race in '05. That's one thing about a road race too. If you've been stuck starting further back, just try and keep your nose clean, and there is a good chance that sheer attrition will help you to picking up a decent finish. Tony Liberati, more commonly known in NASCAR as Rambo. You might have noticed that nicknames seem pretty common in our sport. I mean, you may not believe this, but Spud ain't what my folks called me at my birth. Anyway, Rambo was our crew chief at the time. He's the one on the left. Tony is a former Marine and could be as tough as nails, but he's a super guy, and I'm glad to say that he's my friend. Before the Fontana race, Rambo called the road crew into his office, which was right next to mine, and went over a few things. One of which was that he expected us to wear our team yellow dress shirts and a pair of slacks on the flights to the tracks that year. We could wear whatever we wanted on the flights home, but he wanted us dressed up for the flights out. I'd been with Phoenix Racing for a few years at this point and spoke up. I said I didn't much care for this idea, that we'd always been pretty informal at Phoenix Racing. After the meeting, Tony asked me to stay for a minute. He said he'd prefer it if I'd back him up on this instead of fight him. I really like Rambo, and you've got to let a leader lead. A crew chief is a lot like an NFL coach. When he comes to a team, he has to make it his own, and that often includes inculcating a culture into an organization. I wanted him to succeed, so I agreed to go along to get along. I've got a reputation for being a bit salty, but at heart, I am a team player. Sunoco had become the official fuel of NASCAR in 2004. Unlike every other race, where they send a tanker truck to the track for our fueling needs, they sent the race gas down to Mexico City in 55-gallon drums. They had to hand pump all that gas when they were filling our cans before and during the race. We know the empty weight of those cans, and the first thing that gets done is to weigh each of the cans when full and to write it down. After a pit stop, the cans are weighed again, and those numbers are given to the fellow who figures out the gas mileage. In addition to gassing the car, I was also the guy who figured the mileage. You take the total number of pounds of gas it took to fill the car and convert that to gallons. We need a gas constant, how many pounds a gallon of gas weighs, in order to figure that, and Sunoco will usually let you know what it is with the initial fill-up. It doesn't vary much, but it does vary a little, and it is partly dependent on temperature. We wouldn't be getting that number at this track. Luckily, they also provide a chart of what gas weighed at different temperatures, and I carried a gas thermometer for such a possibility. If you plot weight versus temperature, it is a linear relationship, and so I had that equation included in the spreadsheet I had made over the years to figure my mileage. I just entered the temperature into a box at the start of the race, and viola, I had my constant. That spreadsheet evolved a lot over the years and got to looking pretty complicated, but I kept track of a lot more info than just the mileage stuff. I mean, it wasn't like I was keeping track of the planets in the sky, but who came on what lap, did they take 2 tires or 4, things like that were nice to have at your fingertips. And when Nick Harrison was our crew chief a few years later, he relied on me being able to provide that info when asked. I have to confess that when I figured mileage, I might have been guilty of suggesting on more than one occasion that we come 1 lap earlier than what we could actually stretch to. Nobody wants to be the guy who ran the car out of gas. Chuck Myers and I had worked together for years, and he knew I'd shade the mileage just a little. And so when he became the crew chief, he told me, "Spud, give me the real number and I'll take responsibility for the call." At a road course, you figure your pit strategy backwards. In order to gain track position, you don't pit when you are almost empty, you pit as soon as your window opens up. In the 2005 race, the way the pit stops fell, we came on lap 46, more about that pit stop later, and were good to the end of the race and then some. That was not the case in 2008, our final race in Mexico City. Mike Bliss was our driver that year, and finishing the race was looking pretty sketchy. I told the guys that we would cross the finish line, but that I doubted that we would make it taking the shortcut through the infield and back to the garage. We did. However, I drained the fuel cell when the car got back to the shop in Spartanburg, and there wasn't enough gas to fill a Coke bottle. Oh, and Mike finished 9th at that race. When I was the gas man, before each race, I would try to make the fireman that was responsible for our pit my new BFF. I'd ask him his name, where he was from, etc., etc. And after I'd faked that I really gave a rat's ass, I'd tell him that if I caught on fire to put my face out first because my face was my moneymaker. I would also tell him that if I needed him, I would give him a sign. That sign would be me throwing the gas can as far away as possible and then running around and screaming like a little girl. This is my fireman for that 2005 race. Getting to be buddies was a bit more difficult because of the language barrier. My Spanish is pretty much exhausted after I've said "uno más cerveza por favor." Donde está el baño? And tienes la hermana? This roughly translates into may I have another beer please? Where is the bathroom? And do you have a sister? It all worked out okay though. The fireman I had in 2006 proved to be a bit more problematic. We were still facing the language barrier, and when we were coming in for our pit stop, something happened in the pit ahead of us. I don't remember what it was, but it was a safety issue. The fireman got it into his head that he needed to stop me from gassing the car, and kept trying to pull the can out of my hands. I kept dog cussing him and pulling the can back. We were finally able to settle our differences when I resorted to the international sign for I am fixing to kick your ass. Now about that pit stop on lap 46. The leader, the 8 car, had just pulled onto pit road and was headed to his pit. We were running in 6th place when Ruben Garcia Navoa in the 72 car packed it into the fence. Rambo quick got on the horn and told Boris to pit, pit, pit before the caution came out. Boris did just that and said good call. We got the stop done, went back out, and were sitting pretty and starting in 6th place for the final run. And we already knew that Boris was faster than some of the cars ahead of us. Anyway, we were coming to the green flag with 22 laps to go when NASCAR informed us that we didn't beat the caution, had pitted too soon, and would have to drop to the back. Rambo was livid and argued with our official. But getting in a pissing match with NASCAR never seems to work in your favor. You are standing flat-footed on the ground, and NASCAR is standing up on a step ladder. So now we took the restart all the way back in 32nd place with 22 laps to go. Boris was as angry as a wet tomcat and drove the car like a man possessed. He had climbed up to 15th place with 23 laps to go, and he passed Rusty Wallace in the 64 car for 5th place, which is where we finished, with 6 laps to go. By that time, Boris had pretty much used up both his tires and the car, and couldn't catch Shane Mill in the 32 car for 4th. Now take a look at the nose of our car before the race, and then compare that to the nose after Boris had climbed all the way back into the top 10. I can't help but remember race morning in 2007. It was still dark 30, and we were at the hotels. Most of us had found our seats on the buses and were waiting for the usual stragglers to come outside and climb aboard, when we heard a female voice calling out the name of one of our teammates. We all looked out the windows and could see this little gal running around one bus and then the next, looking up in the windows and plaintively calling his name. I looked over at him, and he was scrunched down in his seat as low as he could possibly go. This fellow, and how do I put this delicately, liked to spend his evenings fraternizing with the local womenfolk of whatever town we were racing in that weekend. So we were all staring questioningly at him, and he sheepishly admitted that in order to secure access to her charms, he may have led this last to believe that after the race he was going to take her home with him to North Carolina. Needless to say, the words and actions of this teammate are completely his own and do not reflect the opinions of this YouTube channel. I see that our simulated race is winding down and just about over. Thank goodness loading our simulated hauler doesn't take more than the click of a button. In real life, it was a time-consuming pain in the butt. After the race, by the time we got everything off pit lane and out of our garage stalls and loaded up, we literally climbed on board the last bus to leave for the airport. The buses and a big pile of all of our luggage were across this big thoroughfare called the Avenida Rio Churubusco, and in the parking lot of the indoor arena on the other side that was called the Palacio de los Deportes. It was one of the venues that had been built for the 1968 Summer Olympics. Anyway, to get over there, we had to use a pedestrian crossover. I want to point out that Mexico City is sitting 7,350 feet above sea level. After you climbed what seemed like an endless stairway to heaven up to this crossover, you were feeling pretty well gassed and had to pause for a moment to catch your breath. At least the folks down there had big tubs of beer sitting in the parking lot for us. I was kind of partial to the Negro Modelo myself. So we get on a bus, everyone is slap wore out, and poor Matt Greshel is passed out hard. It was going to take a while to get to the airport, and so our motor guy, Cale Bass, pulls out a black Sharpie, says he wonders what Matt would look like as Charlie Manson's little brother, and very slowly and gently draws that thingy on Matt's forehead. Then Seabass says, "Oh, what the heck, let's go full Adolf on our friend," and proceeds to draw a pretty good rendition of the little Bavarian corporal's mustache on Matt as well. Matt stirred a bit and drowsily opened his eyes, and Seabass and I waved high. We got all the way to the airport without him knowing and couldn't wait to see what Mexican Customs and Immigration might have to say to him, when one of the ladies in charge of our flight stopped Matt and said, "Hey, you got a little something on your face." The 12-foot Stanley tape measure is a ubiquitous little device that is found throughout any NASCAR garage or race shop. When we got to the airport, a lot of the guys still had one hooked onto their belt. For some reason, when we went through airport security, they must have figured those little tape measures posed a serious threat as potential weapons, because they confiscated every last one of them. There had to be a pile of some 30 to 40 tape measures on the table that the security guys were standing at. There's the white flag. 1 lap to go, and Martin Truex in the number 8 car has led this simulated race from the get-go. It has been a pretty boring race up front with virtually no passing for position. All the excitement occurred further back in the pack. Once we got out to the plains, it seems that it took forever before we started taxiing out and got airborne. The charter folks had a nice meal waiting for us, though. Getting through Mexican Customs and Immigration turned out to be a breeze compared to what was waiting for us when we landed back in Charlotte. The U.S. Customs and Immigration folks must have decided that they wanted us to never forget our return to the good old USA, because they stretched out the experience of passing through Customs and Immigration for as long as they could. Now, all that was left for our Mexico City weekend to be over was the 1-hour van ride back to the shop in Spartanburg. And Martin Truex takes the checkered flag to win our simulated race. Boris, in the 1 car, finishes in 5th. And Johnny Sauter comes home in 16th place. Martin won the real race too, and in commanding fashion. Boris started 4th and finished 5th, which was our best finish down in Mexico in the 4 races we ran down there from 2005 to 2008. And Johnny Sauter drove a very smart race, stayed out of trouble all day, and came home in 11th spot. I want to thank you all for watching this video, and if you would oblige me, remember to hit the subscribe button and to like this video. Adios.